Chapter 11, Zimbabwe. When I arrived in Northern Rhodesia in 1961, Zimbabwe was Southern Rhodesia. It was the dominant part of the Federation. When the Federation broke up, it was just Rhodesia, illegally independent under the regime of Ian Smith from 1965. When it became clear that white rule had to end, an internal settlement was stitched together and the country became Zimbabwe Rhodesia. This only lasted from July to December 1979. Negotiations at Lancaster House in London brought back the legal colonial name Southern Rhodesia for a few months before it became independent as the Republic of Zimbabwe in April 1980. I recently found a letter I had written to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, in January 1980 to criticise the British government's disregard for the Lancaster House Agreement by allowing the continued presence of South African troops, allowing free movement of Rhodesian troops while the Patriotic Front forces were confined to assembly points and not even-handed when dealing with the former combatants. The election in February 1980 gave ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe, 57 seats out of 100. The Smith regime and the sanctions imposed upon it had terrible economic consequences on Zambia: fuel rationing, shortages and high prices. Zambia suffered from its principled support of liberation, although there were a lot of jokes about Zimbabwean leaders sitting in restaurants in Lusaka eating chicken in a basket. At Colombo Secondary School, we were very conscious of the tension across the border, especially when one of our students was imprisoned after he'd gone home for the holidays. Edith and I went into Rhodesia in 1967 and visited the well-preserved archaeological sites at Kami, Nalitale and the amazing complex of Great Zimbabwe. On the road north from Fort Victoria was a big sign with the slogan, "Rhodesia is super," and on the main road to Bulawayo, Guelo says, "Thank you, South Africa." On our way back to Zambia, we stopped at the Kariba Dam and took a boat ride. The white boatmen talked non-stop about how Rhodesia had the most stable government in the world. We kept our argument polite in case he ripped us into the lake. The Smith regime was to end 13 years later. The Africa Centre had very good relations with Zimbabwe's post-independence government. Herbert Murerwa, the High Commissioner, was a member of our Council of Management and gave his full support to the exhibition of Zimbabwe's stone sculpture, which had been put together by our Zimbabwean staff member, Keith Shiri. Our DJ and music organiser, Twendepi Dangerimbizi, otherwise known as Walla, was also from Zimbabwe, and he brought us music by Thomas Mafumu, the Bundu Boys, and many more. Innocent Katsiga attended the CCIVS work camp and seminar which we organised in 1993 in Namibia. By the following year, he had created the Zimbabwe Work Camps Association, which was to have its first work camp and seminar in the suburb of Epworth, famous for its balancing rocks. It was a truly international event with participants from Zambia, Botswana and Germany, plus visitors like us from Britain and lots of Zimbabweans. The opening day was a Sunday and we all went for a picnic at Lake Chivero. Apart from the physical work, building teachers' houses at Epworth School, ZWA had a stall at the Harare Agricultural Show, where we had both President Mugabe and Nelson Mandela speak at the opening ceremony. On that day, Mandela, the older man, seemed to me the more sprightly of the two. Edith and I then left the camp and went to stay in Bulawayo with Fanuel Mafua, a great friend who had been our student at Chizongwe School. We went up onto the Matopo Hills to see Cecil Rhodes's grave and the fine rock paintings in nearby caves. Fanuel then accompanied us to his home village near Masvingo, the former Fort Victoria. The village is surrounded by the huge, smooth rocks typical of central Zimbabwe. We visited the magnificent ruins at Great Zimbabwe a second time. White Rhodesians were unwilling to believe that Africans had been capable of building such a huge complex, and they tried to find all sorts of solutions to what they thought was a mystery. Archaeologists and other scholars could see that the pattern of the ruins was similar to that of other traditional courts in the area, but just on a bigger scale and built of stone. It was, in fact, the centre of a rain-making cult. The scholars have won the argument. We drove east, crossing the iconic Birchenough Bridge over the Save River, which was designed by the man who also designed the Sydney Harbour Bridge, though it's only 2/3 of its size. Then the road climbed up through forest fires into the Vumba Mountains, where a friend of Fanuel's had lent us an enormous bungalow with a wide view over the hills and nearby there was a distant panorama down into Mozambique. On our return to Harare, the work camp was ending, and Innocent asked me to open the seminar, which was really the official launch of the Work Camp Association. There were discussions on issues such as rural development, AIDS, and youth leadership. The final party included a church choir, the presentation of all the volunteers to the local people who had come for the ceremony, the treasurer's speech, and a lot of cool drinks and beer. My next visit in 2003 was to help lead another similar seminar organised by the Zimbabwe Work Camps Association and CCIVS. We attended the Heroes' Day ceremony, where President Mugabe spoke at great and boring lengths about his plans to revive the flagging economy. After the seminar, we moved off to ZWA's efficient-looking farm to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the association. There was plenty to celebrate. Innocent had built up a team of active members. They had a strong programme of international work camps and hosted volunteers from Europe, especially from Germany, where they had a partnership with some members of the Social Democratic Party. However, as Zimbabwe's political and economic situation deteriorated, it became harder to attract foreign volunteers and funding. Sadly, the dynamic Katsiga died in 2011, but ZWA, now led by Rutherford Mwaruta, has survived and is taking the lead in reviving the regional coordinating structure, Southern African Works Cooperation. By 2003, our friend Fanuel had moved from Bulawayo to a corner of his home district. After leaving school, he had been selected to train as an engine driver when most of them were white. He transferred to Zimbabwe Railways later and managed to commute his pension just before the Zimbabwe dollar became worthless, and with this he built his farmhouse and began to construct a guest house for visiting tourists. He was already struggling with lack of fuel and the prospect of no tourists as Zimbabwe descended into economic crisis. In 2012, he was still blaming President Mugabe for all his woes. He died in 2013, and I went for his memorial, joining all his brothers and sisters. His widow had gone off to live in her native Zambia, his daughters and sons, including the burly Nigel, named after me, and working in Botswana as a motor engineer, plus much of the local population. On my way to Fanuel's memorial, I lugged a heavy suitcase full of books published by Books of Africa. They were put on display at the Book Cafe in Harare, a wonderful social centre for music, meetings, food and books, set up by Paul Brickhill. It was not loved by the regime. Morgan Tsvangirai, the opposition leader, had launched his book there. I also visited the Mbira Centre, the brainchild of Albert Chimedza, who has devoted himself to the promotion and manufacture of the mbira, the iconic traditional Zimbabwean thumb piano. He has modified the Indonesian gamelan notation for use with the mbira, and he offers mbira to schools and has even introduced it to the Zimbabwe police band.